Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 133, Nosey Bob. I was asked by a close family friend to look into who was the hangman that was behind the 3 hangings that occurred in early Deniliquin. And I didn't know much about him, and to my surprise, there was only one hangman at the time in Sydney, and he went out across all of New South Wales to perform his duty. The hangman was Robert Howard, and his nickname was Nosey Bob. He executed Henry Tester at Deniliquin, New South Wales, and Henry Tester was the man who killed little Louisa Preston in episode 4, Murder. Robert Rice Howard was born in early 1832 in Norfolk, England, to Henry Howard and Mary Ann Rice. In 1858, the 26-year-old Howard worked as a coachman like his father. Howard later claimed to be related in a very distant way to the Duke of Norfolk. He married Jane Townsend, the daughter of a stonemason, at St Luke's Church in Charlton, now a suburb in southeast London. In the 1861 census, Robert and Jane Howard were living at Bermondsey, and Robert's occupation was recorded as a coachman and domestic servant. In 1862, the family were living at Tedbury in the county of Gloucestershire. The Howards then decided to emigrate to Australia. Their children, Mary Ann was 5, Emily 3, and Edward was an infant, and they left England in November 1865 aboard the Legion of Honour and arrived in Moreton Bay, Queensland in early 1866. Robert was recorded as a butcher on the immigration records. They gave birth to a 4th child, Fanny, in Brisbane, and the growing family moved again, leaving Queensland for New South Wales, where they soon expanded their family to have Sydney and William George. Howard's parents then immigrated to Australia from Norfolk, England in 1866, and his father started a cab trade in Sydney's CBD. In 1868, Howard was recorded as a cabman in Sydney. Howard was so successful as working as a cabman that he became a cab proprietor as well as a driver. One reference states that he was a proprietor of a hansom cab for which he earned a respectable living, and he had the reputation for being clean, capable and punctual. Howard was considered to be polite and well presented to his customers despite the long hours and the physical demands of keeping a cab and horse. Howard built up a profitable clientele amongst the wealthy residents of suburbs such as Darling Point, and he was often called upon as a cabman for government jobs. Howard at the time was described as a tall and good-looking man who passed for an Adonis amongst the horsey crowd. His taxi was even the mode of transport for the Duke of Edinburgh when he came to Sydney in 1867. In 1873, an incident occurred involving a coach driven by Robert Howard, which was conveying the Governor of New South Wales and his family. On the evening of the 14th of July 1873, Sir Hercules Robinson was riding with his wife and children in a carriage drawn by 2 horses on their way to attend the theatre. As the carriage descended a hill in Elizabeth Street, the pole chain gave way and startled the horses, causing them to bolt. One of the wheels hit a rut, and the driver of the vehicle, named Howard, was thrown from his seat. The coach was eventually brought to a standstill without further incident. A newspaper report of the accident attributed no blame to Howard, who received injuries to his knees from the fall and had to be conveyed home in a cab. During the period that Howard worked as a cabman in Sydney, he had an accident that involved a kick to his face by a horse that left him disfigured without a nose. The terrible disfigurement was instant and irreparable. One account stated that Howard lost his nose by a horse kick in a Bligh Street livery stable. He stated, "I used to drive a cab. I was always amongst horses from a boy, but although I had a good turnout and was always well dressed, I found that the public, ladies particularly, objected to engage me owing to this disfigurement, which I had suffered through an accident with a horse." There is another theory attached to his disfigurement of his nose. Multiple illustrations portray him with what people call a saddle nose, which is an affliction where the bridge of the nose has collapsed. Trauma is a possible cause, but in the 19th century it was also associated with diseases such as leprosy and syphilis. In May 1874, Howard was fined 20 shillings plus costs for furious driving, in addition to a further penalty of 10 shillings with costs on a charge of using obscene language. 3 months later, he was again charged with using obscene language and fined 10 shillings. In May 1875, Howard was fined 40 shillings in the Central Police Court in Sydney for having by furious driving endangered public safety. Howard's court appearances during this period were probably a result of him being under extreme financial pressure. The accident had a profound effect on Howard's life, as thereafter his business as a cab owner fell off. Aside from having upper-class ladies shying away from employing him, he began to suffer cruel jibes from fellow cabmen, leading to his determination to change his mode of obtaining a livelihood. He had a wife and 6 children to support, and he probably felt he had only few options. The post of assistant executioner became vacant. I applied for it and got it. I had no idea then of becoming the principal, but that fell to me in due course. The role of assistant hangman paid a decent wage. The annual hangman's salary was £156, and it also offered repeat work. At the time that he was employed as an assistant hangman, the family were living at Woolloomooloo. It's generally agreed that Howard's career as a hangman began in 1875 as an assistant hangman when George Pitt was executed in June 1876 in Mudgee. When Daniel Boone was hung in July 1876 in Wagga Wagga, the assistant executioner was mentioned in newspaper reports as a man whose naturally repulsive appearance was heightened by the absence of any nose. When he was first appointed, Howard tried to augment his salary by working on the side in the household of the New South Wales Sheriff, William Cowper. He soon relinquished the job after a dinner party given by Mrs. Cowper was ruined when guests learnt that the cutlery they were using had been polished by the same fingers that adjust the noose around local murderers' throats. By the time Peter Murdoch was hung in Wagga Wagga in December 1877, it's likely that Robert Howard became the principal hangman. When Alfred, an Aboriginal man, was hung in June 1879 in Mudgee, it was clear that Howard now held the position of senior executioner for the colony of New South Wales. By this stage, Howard was living with his family in a cottage in Paddington, which he owned freehold. The cottage was in Weedon Lane and described as a quiet part of Paddington. As a salaried civil servant, Howard was employed as a general utility during the periods his services as executioner were not required, and his duties included garden maintenance on the grounds of the Darlinghurst Courthouse and attending to the sheriff's horse and buggy. There was a stigma attached to the role of the hangman, however, and his employment was not published in the New South Wales Government Gazette until 1896, and he wasn't on the public service list until 1897, which created some confusion around the dates of his first work on a scaffold. When Howard was first publicly listed as a civil servant, he'd actually been the principal hangman for about 2 decades. J.F. Archibald, the co-founder of the Bulletin newspaper, interviewed Howard, and he told Archibald that he took the job and he was not ashamed of it. He explained that he was a comfortable man who could support his children. They were all clean, well-read and well-mannered. Despite a happy home life, the task of the executioner took a toll. Howard, like many of his predecessors in the role, was known to drink, although he never appeared to be drunk on the job. His drinking was reported as early as the late 1870s, and by the mid-1880s, his problems with alcohol were widely acknowledged. It had to be admitted that Robert usually gives his way to drink and may often be seen, clad in the strictest black, helplessly clasping a lamppost. Howard wasn't like other executioners, though, whose lives were checkered by poverty and insanity. He would turn up in a neat dark suit, he never drank on the day of the execution, and without fail would walk up to the condemned and say in a distinctive snuffly voice, "My poor man, or poor woman, no one regrets this more than I do." Socially, he was a very caring individual and was said to assist in any deserving case, including discharged prisoners or the families of those imprisoned or executed. This earned him another nickname, the gentleman hangman. He used to boast that every one of his executions over a 29-year career were carried out with the utmost decorum, causing the least brutality or pain to the subject. Robert performed 66 executions at Darlinghurst Jail, 7 at Old Dubbo Jail, and acted as a guest hangman in other states and even in New Zealand. At Darlinghurst Jail, he hung most of the famous criminals of colonial Sydney, including Louisa Collins, known as the Borgia of Botany, the last woman to be hung in New South Wales, which I created a bonus episode on, bonus episode 24. The Maitland Mercury reported that Nosey Bob crafted a poem to Louisa Collins, who was the only woman that he would hang. As she was led from the condemned cell to the gallows, he apparently recited, "My pretty Louise, step on the trapeze, and I'll let you down with the greatest of ease." His wife of almost 20 years died at her home, aged 42, on the 22nd of August 1878, of a disease of the lungs and pleuritic effusion, in other words, water on the lungs. After his wife's death, Howard raised his children as a sole parent. By 1896, he was proudly able to state that I reared a family of 5, brought them up without their mother, whom death removed. They have all turned out to be good and biddable children and have not given me nor anyone else any trouble. Despite his success as a hangman, Howard continued to struggle socially. He battled public revulsion and private loneliness. Executioners would often wear disguises or use false names, but Howard never tried to hide when he walked down the street. He not only faced abuse and insult due to his disfigurement, but was loathed as a hangman, due both to changing attitudes and the fact that he tended to botch executions from time to time, either unnecessarily causing prolonged deaths or near decapitations. Nosey Bob continues in his interview with Archibald for the Bulletin, saying that he expressed his satisfaction with his lot in life. The path to the door of his cottage was overarched by vines laden with ripened grapes, and he described his garden as the prettiest in Paddington, with the biggest cabbages and the finest flowers. And then during the interview, Howard describes his preparations for an execution. He said, "The night before, I fixes all the things I remember. Then I takes my pipe in my mouth and walks up and down and says to myself, is there anything more? If there's anything more, I thinks of it." He added, "It doesn't do to get flurried, for the day you gets flurried, that's the day you makes the mistake." In regard to the condemned prisoners, Howard explained, "I always gets their height and weight, but I don't go near 'em until their time comes." Archibald's description of Howard in the January 1880 article was particularly harsh. He described Howard as a creature that looks what he lives to be, a human ghoul, a fiend incarnate. The hangman's physical attributes were described as ape-like, 6 foot high, broad-shouldered, long-armed, flat-footed and sinewy. Nosey Bob, during his tenure as an executioner, witnessed some scientific developments designed to improve the process of hanging. An official table of drops was created in 1888 and updated in 1892. These tables, an improvement on the standard long drop of 8 feet that had been determined in 1880, took some of the guesswork out of hanging by listing how far a felon had to fall based on their weight in pounds to facilitate a dislocated neck as swiftly and cleanly as possible. Basically, the heavier the criminal, the shorter the drop. Unfortunately, mistakes were made. At one extreme, the condemned could be strangled. When Henry Tester was hung in December 1882 in Deniliquin, it was 35 minutes after the bolt was drawn before he was declared dead. At the other extreme, prisoners could lose their heads. When William Lydiard was hung in June 1886 in Grafton, it was declared that death must have been instantaneous, for the head was almost severed from the body by the rope. Howard claimed he'd had very few bungles, but the newspapers disagreed, and Nosey Bob, as the press labelled him, was the subject of dozens of damning articles. When he botched the hangings of Montgomery and Williams, newspaper headlines such as "Our Hangman's Horrible Blunder," "A Horrible Bungle," "Horrible Bungle on the Scaffold," and another bungle appeared across the country. An 1880 newspaper article referred to executioners as finishers of the law, and an 1897 biographical article about Howard in Sydney's Truth newspaper was titled "The Finisher of the Law." Howard's 18-year-old daughter Emily died in December 1880 at Paddington. She'd suffered from heart disease for at least 9 years and had developed dropsy prior to her death. In 1881, Howard was described as a big man, presenting an unprepossessing appearance, noseless and bearded like a pard. In March 1882, Howard was charged with assaulting a man named Charles McLean. The incident occurred late at night outside Howard's cottage in Paddington, resulting in McLean receiving a fractured skull. McLean's version was that he was passing by the house on his way home when Howard's dog, which was lying on the doorstep, rushed at him. As he attempted to drive it away, Howard opened his door, dressed in his nightshirt, and after abusing McLean, struck him in the head with a weapon. Howard's version of events was that McLean was drunk. He threw stones at Howard's dog and shouted, "Come outside, you blip hangman." When he appeared at the door, Howard claimed that McLean grabbed his leg and tried to pull me down the steps, adding, "I then hit him with the leg of the chair to save myself." Howard was allowed bail and committed to stand trial in early April. At the trial on the 4th of April at the Court of Quarter Sessions at Darlinghurst, evidence presented by Howard's defence counsel highlighted McLean's quarrelsome disposition and his drunken state on the night of the incident. Howard's next-door neighbour, Margaret Toohey, stated in her evidence that McLean threatened to flatten the defendant's face as well as his nose, adding that she considered her neighbour to be a quiet, unoffensive man. After a short deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty and Howard was discharged. There was evidence of the public's refusal to have anything to do with Nosey Bob. In the Armidale items, on the 23rd of November 1882, it says, "Nosey Bob, the hangman, had the coach to Uralla all to himself this morning. The other passengers refused to travel with him." Nosey Bob was sent down to hang Cordini in Deniliquin during his time as an executioner, and in the Wollongong Illawarra Mercury, on the 12th of July 1884, it makes an account. It says, "Ill-treating of a hangman. A great deal of ill feeling has been aroused in Sydney at the unfriendly treatment by the Hay people of the hangman and his assistant, who has been engaged at the execution of Cordini at Deniliquin. A slight like this on one of the most favoured and obliging Sydney officials is not likely to soon be forgotten. Mr. Robert Howard, the New South Wales finisher, is a gentleman who almost every day takes his seat amongst ladies in the Paddington tram, passes their fares and gives them change, and otherwise makes himself most agreeable. Certainly Mr. Howard's appearance is not attractive, with the absence of a nose, whence comes the sobriquet Nosey Bob, but otherwise he is a most acceptable fellow passenger. It has to be admitted, of course, that as the fateful day approaches, Robert usually gives way to drink, but on this occasion he does not appear to have touched a drop, so that his reception at Hay is unkind. Here is a telegram on the subject. The hangman arrived in Hay on the 17th from Deniliquin with his assistant. They had their meals at the Tattersalls Hotel, but no one would sit at the table with them. They could get no beds, and the police had to accommodate them at the courthouse. On Wednesday, the hangman started to trudge through the mud to get to the railway station, but his assistant waited to get a lift in a cab. All the cabs refused to take him. He had therefore had to walk to the station, and on Thursday he cleared. This kind of treatment is very ill-advised. Mr. Howard may be required at no distant date at Hay. On the 20th of March 1886, another article says, "Nearly everyone who is going home now has been appointed a commissioner for the Indian and Colonial Exhibition. Nosey Bob, the esteemed and popular hangman, who is about to proceed to England, and who previous to his departure is to be entertained at a banquet by the ghosts of those to whom he has given a drop too much, was offered a position on the commission. He firmly and emphatically declined, remarking that he had met with rum customers in his time, but he must draw the line somewhere. Nosey could not jeopardise his character by associating with some of the members of the commission who had been gazetted." And on the 25th of February 1887, the New South Wales executioner Nosey Bob was employed to hang Caffrey and Penn, the Great Barrier Island murderers, in New Zealand. In about 1887, Howard began living in a 4-roomed weatherboard cottage at North Bondi in close proximity to Bondi Beach. It was built on Brighton Boulevard on Ben Buckler Point, near the northern end of Bondi Beach, one of the first cottages built in that locality. His house was described as standing in an isolated and somewhat lonely position. It had a view of the ocean to the east and the southeast. It was described as a breezy, picturesque and healthy spot, the hill at the rear, with its scrub and wildflowers and rocks forming a dark green background. At that time, the Bondi area was sparsely populated, described as a quiet suburb and serviced by a tram from the more popular inner city. In November 1887, Robert Howard was assaulted and maltreated by a group of young men as he was returning to his home at North Bondi. The report of the incident in the Evening News cited the case as an example of the larrikin nuisance occurring at Bondi, carried out by young men whose numbers and audacity seemed to increase and grow in exact proportion to the laxity of police supervision. In Howard's case, his assailants appeared to have a prejudice against the hangman's profession and resented his having exercised it on some of their friends. It is a probable reference to the executions of the Mount Rennie rapists in January 1887. The episode occurred at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. After he'd finished work for the day, Howard travelled from Darlinghurst by tram and called in at Brown's public house at Bondi for a beer. After being served, the barman began an aggressive exchange with his customer, saying, "You are the one that put the rope on the neck of Moonlight and Rogan." The barman then took Howard's beer and pitched it out into the sand. As he later described the incident, Howard was then set upon by 4 young men at the hotel who struck him about the head and kicked him and said they would hang me. He managed to escape and ran back to the tram depot but was unable to find anyone to assist him. After a while, Howard ventured back past Brown's public house, which he had to pass to reach his home. The 4 young men were on the veranda and assaulted him again. They tore his coat and attempted to throw him over the road embankment. As described by Howard, they swore they would settle me one day and burn my place down. In the Sydney Australian Star on the 10th of January 1889, there was an article titled "The Recent Execution." "Sir, one can hardly read the published accounts of the terrible and sickening tragedy enacted within Darlinghurst without feeling the most intense disgust at and hatred of a system under which such brutal scenes can be committed. We have an unfortunate fellow creature, and a woman too, led out by the hangman, not simply to have her life taken away for the crime she is said to have been guilty of, but in the carrying out of the sentence we find it has been done under the most unpardonably brutal conditions possible. That's such a scene as that enacted on Tuesday. Here we have a whole posse of officials who have something over 4 weeks since this woman's condemnation in which to see that the instrument of death was in perfect working order for this occasion, and it could only be through the most culpable carelessness that such an awful bungle occurred. Who is responsible? Has Nosey Bob been receiving a salary together with his assistant only to enable him to loaf about, and when the time comes for their special duties to be performed, for them to bungle it in an infernal manner? Is there no superior whose duty it is to see that they did theirs and that the drop was in a proper condition? If so, then each of these men, both executioners and sheriff too, should be called sternly to account and meet with their deserts. Here, at the end of the 19th century, we have had performed in the name and with the sanction of the people of New South Wales one of the most barbarous, disgusting and degrading sights that any man could witness. At once we should bring a bill to repeal these acts, which in their being carried into effect make it possible for such terrible scenes to occur as were witnessed in the executions of the Mount Rennie boys and Louisa Collins. Yours, Reginald Lindley. And on the 9th of November 1889, Thomas Riley was hung at Wagga on Wednesday morning for the murder of Christian Eppel. Nosey Bob the hangman couldn't get a cabman who would drive him to the jail from the railway station. Towards the end of his career as an executioner, Howard was a well-known and easily recognised resident of Sydney. In his private life, Howard was said to be a very decent fellow, an ordinary citizen and extremely charitable, and was reputed to have quite a respectable bank balance. He kept a horse at his Bondi cottage, which was used for drawing a trap in which Howard routinely rode from his home across the sandhills to the tram stop or drives into town when the occasion requires. After he dismounted at the tram stop, the animal was trained to return home. Howard had purchased the horse from Rollara for 5 shillings in a starving condition and as wild as a dingo. And talking about his horse, as mentioned, Robert liked to have a drink, and he famously trained the horse to carry a billy and make the return trip from his home to the local establishment across the bay, Dunlop's Cliff Hotel House on the site of the present Astra Hotel. The billy carried a 6pence there and a beer on the way back. Larrikins sometimes would try to intercept the money, or sometimes the beer, but the horse was well trained and resisted the scoundrels. Nosey Bob's last job was a double hanging. Digby Grand and Henry Jones, who were convicted of murder, and this was on the 7th of July 1903 at Darlinghurst Jail. Then, after 28 years of continuous service, Howard retired in May 1904. He was on the same annual salary of £156, roughly equivalent to $150,000 in 2019, that he had been on in 1876. A book that was written on Nosey Bob, an author's summation of his character. And it says, "I think he was a much softer person than the stereotype. He was a family man, and he was incredibly kind to animals. A lot of women quite liked him and saw through the job description and the disfigurement. His retirement ended up being short. He spent time with his family and looked after his animals and tended his garden. He also spent time fishing, and he developed a reputation for being very good at catching sharks. He would set the bait, then use his horse to assist him in pulling the shark out of the water. He also had a large collection of shark jaws to show for this. Robert Rice Howard died of endocarditis and senile decay on the 3rd of February 1906 at the age of 74, less than 2 years after retiring. There was an article outlining his death in the Mullumbimby Star in New South Wales on the 24th of February 1906. The death of Hangman Howard. The remains of hangman Robert Rice Howard were interred in Waverley Cemetery, Sydney. The name Nosey Bob was derived from the misfortune of having his nose smashed badly by the kick of a horse, and the operation that resulted left him completely disfigured. In his younger days he was tall, lithe and good-looking. In the 60s he carried on as a cabman in Sydney, but his living became lessened owing due to his unpleasant appearance. He then accepted a permanent position as assistant hangman, of which he was previously on probation. The first execution at which he assisted was of the Aboriginal named John McGrath for an offence at Bega in 1875. From the time that he resigned office 2 years ago, he had administered the rope to 64 individuals. Howard held office for nearly 30 years, but he was differently placed to others. They had fees, while Howard had a fixed salary of £150 a year and was always employed about the Darlinghurst Courthouse. For many years he resided at Paddington and 15 years ago purchased a freehold on the water's edge at Bondi. From this waterside residence, he travelled to Sydney daily, interfered with no one and mingled with none. A son kept him company in his lonely home. Howard was a charitable man. When John Longford was gatekeeper at Darlinghurst, he had instructions from Howard to let him know of any cases of real distress occurring through the incarceration of the breadwinner in jail. It would not come as a surprise to see an application for probate and a tidy sum paying probate duty. So speaking of his probate, in his will, Howard left to his 3 sons, Edward, Sydney and William, a block each of 3 adjoining blocks of land in Brighton Boulevard, North Bondi. To his 2 surviving daughters, Mary and Fanny, he left blocks of land in Florence Street at Richmond. Any monies held when he died were to be evenly distributed to his 5 children. His son Sydney, who'd been his primary carer, Howard bequeathed all of his personal effects, including clothing, watch, chain and jewellery, furniture, horses, harnesses, vehicles, dogs and poultry. Nosey Bob became a firm feature of popular culture in New South Wales long after his passing, and Nosey Bob became a byword for an executioner in the Australian cultural references for many years. Shortly before Howard died, one author quipped, "I'm that thirsty I drink with Nosey Bob," a phrase that became an Australian colloquialism. When it was rumoured that the judge William Charles Windyer, a man who generated quite a bit of business for the executioner during his career, was writing a book of poetry, it was suggested that the volume should open with an apostrophe to the gallows and to conclude with a sonnet to Nosey Bob, the New South Wales hangman. His first child, Mary Ann, was born on the 19th of November 1859 in Bermondsey, Surrey, England, and she married Edward Hawkins at the Registry Office on the 20th of May 1879. She died in Waverley, New South Wales in 1943 at her residence, Talapay, in South Head Road, Waverley. And they had 4 children, William, Jeannie, Victor and Reg. The second child, as mentioned, Emily Jane Howard. She was born in June 1862 in Tetbury, Gloucestershire, England, and she died from heart disease on the 20th of December 1880 in Paddington, New South Wales, when she was just 18. The third child, Edward Charles Howard, was born in 1865 in England. He married Mary Stevens on the 20th of September 1893 at St Matthew's, Paddington, when he was 28. The fourth child, Fanny May Howard, was born on the 13th of June 1867 in Brisbane. She married Henry Bullenthorpe at St Peter's Anglican Church in Darlinghurst on the 1st of April 1885, when Fanny was only 17. Henry was a mariner at the time of their marriage. He'd been born in England and his father was George Bullenthorpe, who was a detective. They lived at Paddington. They had a daughter, Maria, who died at 3 weeks old, and her funeral was only 10 days after they married. There seems to have been no divorce, but both Henry, who also used the name Harry Harris, and Fanny either commenced relationships or married other people. Harry commenced a relationship with Margaret Frater in about 1886 and had 9 children with her, 4 surviving childhood. Fanny married James Daniel Charles Pemmant on the 31st of July 1888 at the Catholic Chapel Leichhardt. No information on the certificate lists parents or places of birth, and she married as Fanny Howard. They had 3 children together. The first was James Joseph, who was born in 1889, and he died on the 8th of December 1898. Says Pemmant, "In loving memory of my dear son James Joseph Pemmant, little Jimmy, who died at his residence at 16 Bowman Street, Chippendale, aged 9 years, inserted by his loving mother, Fanny Pemmant." Ethel was born in 1891 in Newtown. She married Edgar Holloway in Sydney in 1909 when she was 18. They had 5 daughters, and Ethel died on the 30th of September 1964 in Sydney, aged 73. Winifred Jane Pemmant was born in Newtown in 1893 and married Frederick Henry Nordish in Sydney in 1911 when she was 18. They had 8 children, and she died at St Leonard's in 1968 at the age of 75. Fanny's husband, James Pennant, died on the 29th of March 1895, and there was an article outlining his death. Boating fatality in Sydney. A shocking boating fatality occurred at Botany Bay last night. A party of 6 men had been out fishing and were returning home shortly before midnight. When near Henry Head, they were nearly run down by a steamer. Although they shouted several times and showed a light, it being pitch dark at the time, the steamer shot by and a huge wave caused the boat to be swamped, leaving the occupants struggling in the water. One of them, named Bird, reached the shore stunned and bleeding, and another managed to also reach land, being more dead than alive. The others, named Timothy Brennan, James Pemmant, Thomas Robertson and William Goldsmith, were drowned. The bodies have not been recovered. Pemmant had never been boating before. And another article in the Evening News outlines it in more detail. A boating catastrophe happened in Botany Bay last night when 4 men lost their lives by the swamping of a fishing boat. Yesterday, a fishing party consisting of 5 residents of Waterloo, including James Pemmant, aged 35, bus driver, of 57 John Street, proceeded to La Perouse and hired a fishing boat, a 22-foot half-decker belonging to a fisherman named Goldsmith. The party put in the craft to the sea and were accompanied by the owner of the boat and his son James. From Boat Harbour, some 4 miles seaward from Botany Heads, a start was made home soon after 6 p.m. The wind was light and favourable, and some 4 hours afterwards the little craft made the heads. Goldsmith was steering. Approaching Henry Head on the north side of the bay, a steamer was sighted dead ahead and steering straight for the fishing boat. Goldsmith called to one of the crew to light the lamp and show it to the oncoming vessel. This was done, and Robertson stood thwarting the working of the signals and shouting to the steamer to sheer off. No notice, however, was taken, and seeing that they were in imminent danger of being run down, Goldsmith put the boat about and bore away from the shore. No sooner had this been done that the steamer put a helm hard, a port, and once more bore down on the fishing boat. Unable to understand the meaning of this strange behaviour, the men again hailed the steamer. No answer was forthcoming, and as a larger vessel was now in dangerous proximity, for the second time the fishing boat was put about and headed straight for shore. The steamer shot by and stood on her course. The boat was 150 yards from the shore, and the little party, about to congratulate themselves on their narrow escape, then had a huge wave strike the boat and filling her to the gunwale. And before the thing could be realised, the boat went down like a stone, leaving the 6 occupants struggling for life in a heavy groundswell. Brennan, Pemmant, Robertson and Goldsmith disappeared immediately and were not seen again. On the occurrence becoming known, the botany search parties were at once organised and the shore explored in every direction for any traces of the ill-fated party, but without success. And 2 days later, on the 1st of April 1895, it was reported that the body of James Pemmant, one of the victims of the boating disaster in Botany Bay on Thursday night, was discovered amongst the rocks at Henry's Head on Saturday afternoon. The next day, there was an inquest into the Botany disaster. The city coroner held an inquest at South Sydney Morgue yesterday on the body of James Pemmant, one of the 4 men drowned by the swamping of a fishing boat off Botany Heads on Thursday night. Fanny Pemmant, the deceased widow, was the first witness. She stated that her husband was a native of New South Wales. He had never been in a boat before Thursday last and he could not swim, and he was of temperate habits. And it concluded the evidence with the jury returning a verdict of accidental death. Fanny had another 2 children after her husband's death. Dorothy Vera Pament, who was born in 1903 in Sydney with no father named. Dorothy married Eric Rainsford Wells in Hornsby, New South Wales in 1925 when she was 22, and Dorothy died in Sydney in 1986 at the age of 83. And Walter Morris Pament, who was born on the 23rd of December 1905 in Sydney, again no father listed. Morris married Leah Lillian Rose Rutley on the 20th of November 1926 at St Francis Church, Paddington, Sydney. They had 2 daughters. Walter died aged only 35 on the 27th of November 1941. He was missing, presumed killed. He was an able seaman on the HMAS Parramatta. Fanny was living in Harcourt, New South Wales near Parkes in 1932, and she died on the 25th of February 1935 at Canterbury, New South Wales, aged 67. The next child of Robert Howard's was Sydney. Sydney Howard was born in 1869 in Parramatta. Sydney lived with his wife and family next door to his father at North Bondi, and Sydney died on the 19th of April 1940. And the youngest of the family, William George Howard, was born in 1872 in Sydney and died in 1943 at Randwick, aged 71. Robert Howard had been involved in the executions of 62 people, 59 of them under his direct supervision as a principal executioner, and he was the longest serving of any New South Wales executioner.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.